Welcome to the CEC Report. It's September 9 and I'm Robert Barwick. I'm joined again today by Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
All right, we have an anniversary this weekend. 9/11, 10 years later. The second thing we'll be discussing is Capita says Aussies have never had it so good. And finally, rising unemployment is the tip of the iceberg. So, 9/11, 10 years later. It's the 10th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attacks. What do we know as of now that the dust has cleared, if you can put it that way? Officially, what we're supposed to know is that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda did it. We invaded Afghanistan because of that, topple the Taliban and chase Osama bin Laden. We invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein, even though he had nothing to do with it. We have recently killed, apparently, Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Despite these events, 10 years later, still, United States, British, Aussie and other troops are in Afghanistan dying to protect opium. So that's the official facts of the case. What's the truth? The truth about 9/11 is actually the same as what Lyndon LaRouche stated on the day. Now, for those who don't know this history, the morning of 9/11 US time, Lyndon LaRouche, who was an expert in security and intelligence matters as well as economics, who had been recently effectively yelling his head off, warning of the danger of terrorism in the United States, Lyndon LaRouche was live on a radio show out of Utah, hosted by a man named Jack Stockwell, and they were having a live discussion as the attacks were going to air on US television, and that became the subject of their discussion. And if you ever read that the transcript of the interview, which you can find on the internet, you'll see a lot of what LaRouche said was very prescient. I'll give you one quote that he said right at the beginning of that interview. LaRouche said, "The first suspicion that's going to be on this is Osama bin Laden. That name is going to come up prominently," end quote. LaRouche also made the point that given the scale and the sophistication of the operation, what you're dealing with is an inside job. He couldn't state who, but he knew that by type. All right, the LaRouche Political Action Committee is producing a video called 9/11, 10 years later, which goes through the details of this inside job that we now know, and it traces the funding of the operation back to Saudi Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the British aerospace company BAE Systems, and the nexus between the Saudi Arabian and British royal families. We're not going to talk about so much the details of that today. I urge you to watch the video. The CEC will issue a press release next week with a link to it. Otherwise, you can go straight to the LaRouche PAC website and watch it. What we want to talk about is the context of those terrorist attacks. Craig, that attack happened just as the global financial system was starting to implode. People may not remember that. But to remind the viewers, you had that year, in fact just the immediate months before it, you had Enron's collapse, biggest bankruptcy in history. Tyco, Global Crossing. In Australia we had Ansett Airlines, we had HIH Insurance, we had OneTel, the Jamie Packer Murdoch phone operation. The crash, the economic collapse was so real that we actually had just printed our book, What Australia Must Do to Survive the Depression, and we launched that book the week after 9/11. So isn't it important that people do understand the strategic purpose behind the 9/11 attacks, as LaRouche is exposing in this video, because we are in the same collapse conditions again?
Yeah, Robbie, and don't forget the collapse of the Tech 2000 bubble as well, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of people went under that disgusting scheme. The issue here is that, as Mr. LaRouche actually forecast a couple of months before the 9/11 attacks, that the climate was being set for a Reichstag fire type event. Now, the Reichstag fire was where you had agents, the British in fact, burn down the Reichstag, which is the parliamentary buildings the parliament buildings of the German the people. Now that actually forced Hitler to become the dictator of Germany. Now, when he became the dictator, he began to pass a series of laws called Notverordnung, right, which are the emergency decrees, in order to deal with this Reichstag fire and the pretext for that.
The Enabling Act. Giving the powers that he needed.
Because the intention by Hitler then was to basically take over Germany, run it as a dictatorship, and, and we know what the history was: the destruction of the Jews, destruction of the Gypsies, the takedown of trade unions, the destruction of many, many lives in that country. Well, you see, Mr. LaRouche was saying the same thing about what was going to take place in the United States a couple of months before, because you were having massive riots in places like Seattle and so forth on the streets. And this is in the context, remember, of, as you say, the global financial disintegration. The intention at that point was to move the United States into police state type scenario, bring in dictatorship.
Because that's exactly the same thing that Hitler was. I mean, Hitler established a fascist dictatorship in the context of the Depression,
yes,
on behalf of banks, including George W. Bush's grandfather.
Yeah, and it's funded by the London banks and, as you say, George Bush's grandfather, as part of the intention of using Germany as a way of destroying the United States and other countries at that time. Now, what's important with the whole issue with this 9/11 remembrance just 10 years later is that Mr. LaRouche made it very clear that this wasn't possible without the highest levels of the US government being involved. He said, look, Osama bin Laden's going to get blamed for this, but this couldn't be possible without the highest level of military intelligence and the administration being involved. He said that publicly, and he said it repeatedly.
But just to clarify that, he never ever blamed George W. Bush, because it wasn't so much blame. He said you couldn't give him that much credit.
No, he was busy reading children's books at the time.
That's right. But it was really this secret intelligence apparatus that's so powerful in the world, and especially in the United States.
And we've written an enormous amount about this. And look, we actually in 2004 put out a series of pamphlets which are taken from the US called the Children of Satan 3. But we go through and sort of in this particular pamphlet catalogue what we did in response to what Howard government was doing here in Australia, because the Howard government was elected, it was in power. And Robbie, from about the year 2000 to 2004, over 28 different police state laws were enacted in Australia. Now, we mobilised our organisation big time on this, and for example, in 2002, we actually mobilised a number of different groups around to stop these laws from being enacted at the federal level by Howard. This was called the End Them, Don't Amend Them campaign. It was a very powerful campaign, which we ended up publishing in the Australian on June 12, 2002. The fact that Howard's laws resembled directly the same laws that Hitler brought in when he came to power in 1938. So the issue here for us is, and we continued to campaign, I should say. In 2004, we ran an entire election on this particular issue in 2004 with all our candidates around the country. The intention and the issue is still the same today. We have a massively faster collapsing physical economy. The banks, the financial structures are imploding faster than then. Mr. LaRouche a couple of months back put out the same warning that there's likely to be another 9/11 type event in order to continue to bring about the fascist control of the economy. And when you look back 10 years and you look at all the different controls that have been brought in to stifle the expressions, freedom of speech and so forth, you just see the intention is to destroy the sovereignty of the nations.
Because at all costs, they do not want especially American constitutional response to the crisis. They want to force governments such as the US government into a fascist response that takes away people's rights and just shores up the rights of the banks.
Yeah, and just recently, Barack Obama, who is a puppet of the British, is talking about the Secret Powers Act, bringing in Secret Powers Act modelled on the British Secret Powers Act.
Official Secrets Act.
Official Secrets Act, in order to be able to hide up the sorts of moves, the sorts of moves that they're trying to do in order to suppress the rage and the outrage coming from the population. So this is escalating by the day, and here in Australia, you just continue to see constantly, the sorts of laws that are being passed that are restricting the freedoms of ordinary individuals.
Thanks, Craig. So when you pause this weekend to remember 9/11, as we all should, it's very important that people don't get sort of disarmed by the sentimentality that you'll get from the media about it, and really focus on the actual issue, which is what we've just discussed. But as I said, watch the LaRouche Pack video, 9/11, 10 years later. Second thing, Capita says Aussies have never had it so good. Now, our Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who is a Fabian, she has a think tank that she draws her ideas from called Per Capita. Because of Gillard's obsession with population control and depopulating Australia, we have dubbed this think tank Capita. Capita has produced a report, and this report this week declares that there actually is no cost of living crisis in Australia. The report states that incomes in Australia have risen higher than the consumer price index, i.e. higher than inflation, the measure of the cost of living. It also highlights the fact that households are splurging on luxuries, such as flat screen TVs or whatever, as proof of this. However, it does concede housing costs have risen faster than incomes. So when you're responding to this, Craig, where do we start? I've got a few questions for you.
Oh, well.
One, how reliable is the measure of CPI, Consumer Price Index?
Well, it's a statistical measure, and what they've done is taken a bunch of goods, right, and put them all together. And they don't differentiate between those particular goods and services. And they say, well, that's the measure of the economy. Things like flat screen TVs are in there, price of bananas and all these sorts of things. So you're not, because you're not measuring the necessities of the economy, so you can't really use this as a measurement of the physical well-being or of the people in the economy as a whole. The other thing, it's an average, right? So if you've got a lot of very wealthy people, they necessarily aren't being affected or impacted as much, but you've got a large number of increasingly poor people in this country, particularly pensioners, and those people are impacting greatly. I mean, there's a report that's come out recently of the number of people last year, 27,000 households couldn't afford the electricity over the winter period to keep themselves warm. I mean, that's not reflected in the CPI.
No. By not distinguishing between luxuries and necessities, you can't call it a measure of the actual cost of living, because it's necessities that are the cost of living. One of the things people don't know about the CPI is it's distorted by what they call the Hedonic Index, which is where not only do they give equal weighting to luxuries and necessities, such as the price of milk goes up, I don't know, well, not milk in this case, because Coles is smashing the dairy farmers, but necessities like fruit and veggies go up 20%. Flat screen TVs come down 15%, right? And so they get equal weighting. But this Hedonic Index says that this year's version of the flat screen TV, which is cheaper than last year's, it's also better quality. So you've got to add that extra quality in and give it an even greater weighting. And so consequently, here's Australia with the ultimate paradox. We have this supposedly low inflation rate, but everyone's screaming about the cost of living. We'll talk about the screaming in a minute. Second thing I wanted to put to you is Per Capita was founded and is run by Brits from Tony Blair's own think tank in London called Demos, which of course is a Fabian Society operation. Given it's a Fabian Society operation, how concerned are they really for human welfare?
Well, there's the lie to start with. As soon as you say Fabian Society, you know that these people aren't interested in welfare. The Fabian Society was established by the British, by the establishment, by the British Royal Family, in fact, because that's where the funding came, King Edward VII, in order to attack the real economic development that came out of the Lincoln reforms. the development of the post-Lincoln, or the Lincoln United States, where you had a massive increase in the development of their physical economy through railroads, through manufacturing, and you saw the 1874
76.
76, I keep saying 74, but a 76 exhibition there which brought in people from all around the world. Well, the Fabian Society was established in order to attack that optimism. And because they don't believe, and people like H.G. Wells, the Sydney and Beatrice Webb, and these people believe in the doctrines of Malthus, Parson Malthus, is so not nice, reverent, that believes the world is overpopulated and you have to get rid of people.
Well, and you can quote them at length and prove that, but it's also interesting that Beatrice Webb, one of who along with her husband Sydney founded the Fabians, was the private secretary to both Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog,
That's right.
and Herbert Spencer, the man we quoted last week, saying that it was morally wrong to stop food speculation that made people starve.
Well, there's a case in point, right? Here you have a think cap that wants to take your head off, literally, your Capita, talking about how great things are because they want people to believe in the myth. Now, things are going to get worse and worse, and they're going to keep trying to prop up Julia Gillard's credentials as things get worse and worse. And you only have to look at one aspect of the economy, just one small aspect over this last winter of electricity prices and how they've skyrocketed and how many people. I mean, you've got to distinguish between the middle class and the upper class because in some cases different portions of the different subsets of the economy can afford these price rises, right? In a sense, but the poor people can't.
No.
So,
and then you sort of touched on it a bit, but just to make it more explicit, how does this report's claims fit with the fact we have unprecedented political turmoil in Australia, which has seen the ALP and Gillard collapse in the polls? If the population wasn't being crushed by a cost of living crisis, why would Gillard be so unpopular?
Well, if she was popular, they should be supporting the outlook for the future. The people who have an optimistic outlook, they would see that the economy was growing. They would say that, look, my kids have got a future. You would see the potential would be available for everyone. But what we see with the Gillard government today is their intention explicitly is a Fabian intention, population reduction. It's to tax the economy, which is what the carbon tax is, reduce industrial development, right, because we don't want population. And this is a hard thing for some people to get their mind around because how could you have a government that doesn't support that? Well, that's what the Fabians actually represent. So if she's part of this, and she's a significant part, she's disclosed the fact that she's a Fabian. The guy in the local electorate here, Calvin Thompson, is actively part of the Sustainable Population Australia that are on a crusade, a jihad, you might say, to reduce the world's population, to reduce Australia's population, because, in fact, at the base of it, they don't understand that human beings are not animals. We're not subject to carrying capacity. We're not subject to the normal laws of ecology, which is how the whole Darwin fraud was being perpetrated by people like Arthur Tansley that we've written about extensively, and we're going to write more about it in coming days. We've got more material on that on our website now with the conference videos going up that we've just done recently. So what you're talking about is a cover-up in a sense. The CPI is a cover-up. These sorts of reports put out by Capita are a cover-up because the intention is, the awful intention is to kill off people.
And the cover-up, actually, if you think about it, it's not even so much to convince the population they've never had it go so good, but to convince the decision makers in Parliament who are perpetrating these crimes on the population to keep going and doing it by sort of detaching them from the impact of what they're doing.
The problem is that people have fundamentally don't understand what an economy is, and it's been reduced to a monetarist financial system run by the British oligarchy, the British Empire, as we explain and spell out in many of our publications, that you have an elite, an oligarchy, which means ruled by a few, that want to control the future destiny of all populations and nation states in the world today by controlling their money systems. We reject that. We believe that countries should be sovereign. They should have a national banking system which is controlled by the people through their governing institutions for the development of the physical economy. That is, for the development of the future posterity of those people within their country. You don't see that today. You see the complete opposite with Julia Gillard, and that's why she ain't getting the support. Yep. And neither will Tony Abbott. I mean, these guys are puppets of the same system.
All right, well then finally let's talk about this physical economy question. Rising unemployment is the tip of the iceberg. So this week, economists expressed surprise because we've had a jump in unemployment to a 10-month high of 5.3%. And the surprise related to, for example, Western Australia, the so-called boom state, which we're assured is the only thing keeping us going, which itself experienced a jump in unemployment by 5,000 people. Like the Consumer Price Index, unemployment statistics are deliberately doctored. So some of this you may know. For example, 1 hour's work per week counts you as employed. If that's all you do, you still count as employed, not unemployed. They take the figures of unemployment from a household survey and not from Centrelink. Centrelink pays people the dole if they're unemployed. They don't take Centrelink's figures, they do a survey. Centrelink's figures historically average 3 full percentage points more than the official survey. So if this is 5.3%, Centrelink's will be something like 8.3% on Centrelink Newstart or whatever it's called nowadays. And then you have this aspect called underemployment, which relates to the 1 hour a week thing. At the University of Newcastle, there's an organisation called the Centre of Full Employment and Equity, run by Professor Bill Mitchell, who for a long time has done actual research in real unemployment figures, and so they publicise what they consider the real unemployment. He wrote yesterday, quote, "More worrying, that is, than the official unemployment jump, is that the BS broad labour underutilisation rate, which is underemployment plus unemployment, rose to 12.3% over the last quarter. That is not an economy that is bursting at the seams. The labour market is in reverse gear and accelerating," end quote. So, Craig, isn't unemployment, like the cost of living, a real measure of the physical economy, and how can we address this collapse?
By expanding the pie. The problem we have is that everything today is governed on a certain fixed view of the economy. In mining, right, digging and extracting stuff out of the ground is not an effective part of the physical economy. What I mean by that is that at the moment, all you do is dig the stuff out of the ground and you ship it out. There's no value added, right? There's no commitment by governments that are indoctrinated with free trade, economic rationalist, globalised policies to develop an economy. It's all based upon making money. So what they do, they doctor these figures in order to cover up the real state of the economy. Australia has an enormous potential to develop itself through the use. We've got enormous reserves of nuclear energy, as we've talked about many times on this show. The highest reserves of thorium, and some of the highest reserves of uranium, which are completely undeveloped. We have a country that's completely empty. We need to be able to develop this country by building high-speed rail systems. We've got areas of the country which are in drought, others in constant flood. We need to be able to harness that water. Now, just thinking from a physical economic point of view with a vision for the future, a vision for not just for the future for the sake of it, but for what are our children going to do? What are our grandchildren going to do? And you have to go back to the stories that we've heard many times from our supporters where they watched the building of the Snowy Mountain scheme. Okay, so you give the people a vision of what we can do with our country, and immediately you run up into the problem that we don't have enough people. And there's a real paradox, because you've got all this underemployment and underutilisation and so forth. But when you start to really develop a country and say, okay, we're going to create, a bit like what Whitlam had the idea of creating many new cities in the rural areas, right? It didn't happen, of course, because he was taken apart by the very idea of developing a country sovereignly. It's just not on. But to the degree that you decide to plan to have cities, to plan to have industrial development instead of just mining, but actually build factories, manufacturing plants, smelters, building high-speed rail, you find immediately the limiting factor is the number of qualified people that you have. So
There's a few people up in Christmas Island that might have a few qualifications.
bring them in, right? Because again, under a monetarist system, you treat people like commodities, like slaves. What is their economic value to me as a money maker? What is my profit line going to benefit from by having these people work for me? Instead of the idea, what are you doing for the benefit and future posterity for the country, right? And when you start to look at it from our view, which is the view of a nation state, a sovereign nation state republic, how do we develop our country for the benefit of future generations, for our people at a higher and higher standard of living, then what you realise is that the resources that we have, like people, we don't have enough of them. And if we really treated people well, like you take, for example, the boat people, right? At the moment, they're treated basically like rabid dogs. Like you got this new legislation coming in, they're banning, ferocious, vicious dogs.
Yeah.
Well, that's a bit what they're treating people like, right? They don't make any distinction. If you bring people in to this country and say, look, we'll look after you, we'll give you good jobs, it's not those immediate families that you, or the adults in those families, it's their kids. What's the view of Australia are we giving those kids? And that's the future, that's the intention of what we have to have as a country. And we get away from this stuff from Julia Gillard, this horrendous dark age type economic policy, social policy, immigration policy. It's all dark age policy, Robbie.
And when you say that they've got the economy, they look at the economy from the standpoint, how can we make money? If you take that out of it, the other thing Australians have to consider is not just what's in it for us, but we are, even though we're separated from the world by oceans, we are part of a global community. And so when we think about developing our country, we should be thinking about what we can contribute to the whole world by doing that.
Well, at the moment, all we're doing is shipping off raw materials, right? We're not, one could say, that's helping China, but
people starving in Somalia that need food.
That's right. And we have the potential of a breadbasket here, right? But we're losing our farmers because of these policies. The intention is depopulation, population reduction. It's not an intention to develop the face of the planet for the future generations of people. And there's enormous amounts of space. There's enormous amounts of places that we can develop these food capacities that are not being developed, because the intention by the British Empire is to reduce the population.
Yep. All right, well, thanks again, Craig. That's it for this week's the CEC Report. As I said, watch the 9/11 10 years later video when you get our website, our press release on it. We've also put out a press release today linking to a speech Lyndon LaRouche made yesterday, an emergency presidential statement. Have a look at that. It's quite important. And we'll leave it there. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in again next week for more developments.